All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us here on Unslaved. Happy to be back with you. Today's show is going to be an audio-only podcast. I've just been having a little bit of internet issues over on my end, so we just want to make sure everything's coming through nice and clear. And we are happy to bring back all the way. We haven't had this guest on since the first year of Unslaved. We have PhilosophiCat joining us again, and so we're happy to be back. We're going to be talking about masculinity, Western civilization, a little bit of Julius Evola, and so much more. So, Kat, so good to have you back. It's been a while. Time flies, but welcome back to Enslaved. We're glad to have you.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be back.
Well, what have you been up to? We've been checking out your podcast. You've been covering all kinds of stuff, but you've been keeping busy. It seems like your numbers are growing, and maybe give us maybe a background for people that are new to your work and a little update as to what you've been into lately.
Sure. Well, since the last time I spoke to you guys, my YouTube channel sort of pivoted more towards kind of being like the Julius Evola channel, I guess you could say. I do talk about other things too, of course, but it is very traditionalist related. And I have started making this video series on his book, Revolt Against the Modern World. So each episode covers one chapter of the book. We are soon to release the 14th episode, which has taken us about 2 years and counting to make. And other than that, I mean, I've been still active on all the socials and everything, Twitter, or X as it's called now. I still have the Facebook account. I didn't get banned off of too many things. And I've since, started my astrology practice. I've been working on music, and at the moment, the big project for the year was getting this audiobook done for Inner Traditions for Julius Evola's Eros and the Mysteries of Love, which is now finally released. So, yeah, it's been a busy few years.
Well, congratulations on the book and getting it published with a mainstream publisher. I have to get a copy of that. Is it in Kindle as well?
I just did the audiobook recording, so I know that they have Evola's Eros in Kindle and hard copy and everything because it's been published for a long time. But the audiobook is new, and it's not my book, of course. I just narrated it, but it was still a nice project to do and sort of a nice way to pay back some of the debt to an author who has inspired me and who has been of great benefit to my own life. So I was really honored to be able to do that project where I could kind of help bring these ideas to a more modern audience through a more modern platform.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. What an homage, and that somebody of such caliber who's almost forgotten. Their books are still out there. Men Amongst the Ruins, Ride the Tiger, his work on the Holy Grail. There's so much out there for people to dive into. And he wasn't the only one. There was others. But he's an outstanding figure in so many ways. I got into his work through the English author Jonathan Bowden. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, I met him on a few occasions. I didn't know him well, but I do know him.
He was a larger than life.
Did know him, rather.
Yeah.
Yes, he was a very interesting character.
He was very interesting. I don't agree with everything he was into, but I have a lot of time for him as well, in the sense that he was a pagan, and he had such insight. He didn't just bite down on Nietzsche or Heidegger or in just this sort of a fanboy way. He would give you an interesting twist on everything that he discussed. And that appealed to my mind a lot, because as much as I loved a lot of the people he talked about, he also gave a little bit of his own insights. And so it made you pause and think. He was a great teacher, I think, and he'll be sadly missed. I'm glad there is a channel on YouTube. Maybe David will hook up, to that channel later on, Jonathan Bowden. Specifically, the lecture he gave in a pub in London on Julius Evola, it's smashing. A lot of his lectures were very, very good.
Famous pub lecture.
It was a marvelous thing. Marvelous.
That video of his, I think, has been an entry point for many people to getting into Evola.
Oh, really?
It's often people have told me that that was their first encounter with even learning about Evola and who he is, and I'm always kind of surprised to hear that because I didn't know it was like so widely known.
Right. Yeah, yeah, because Bowden's not that widely known. Um, I had heard the name before, but only as an author, only as one of the European alumni authors, but had no clue what he was actually into. And then later, I found out he was into the caste system, and I thought that was very interesting. I don't know what I had been reading where his name had come up, probably something like Gerald Massey. But again, no deep dive. But yeah, getting into Jonathan Bowden and then hearing this marvelous lecture was really, extremely valid. And then I realized, so then I start reading his actual books, and I loved Men Amongst the Ruins. The whole premise to me, Now, but one thing though, you said you're doing astrology. Just the other day on another podcast, we were talking about astrology with Luke Renda, and because he does it too. And naturally, we were talking about. Oh, yeah, he was one of the guests. We've had him on about 6 times because we're just doing a book. We're covering a book by Carl Jung called The Undiscovered Self. And of course, just like you know already, and you've hinted, it takes a long time. So we've had to go chapter by chapter. So we've had him on about 5 times. So we have to have him on again. But anyway, in that talk, because he also is into astrology, it brought up this whole question of Pluto in Aquarius. But more than that, I added this issue of the Neptune in Aries. Now, I wanted to ask you about that since you are familiar with astrology, because when it comes to what Evola had prophesized about the nature of masculinity, the future of masculinity, I think that Neptune in Aries is a very, very unauspicious conjunction for this. That's my thinking, because of what Aries represents and that what Neptune represents. I was wondering if you agree. I see it as exacerbating what we see today with the gender dysphoria, the loss of masculinity, and in the way that Evola spoke about, and in also other iterations. What is your thinking? Do you see anything positive about Neptune in Aries?
It's a very mixed bag. And I will preface this by saying that mundane forecasting is not my area of specialty. It's not something I've ever been super interested in. So I'm not the best person to do mundane forecasts. But when it comes to, because in the next, 6 months or something, we have all of the outer planets now ingressing into new signs, and they're all masculine signs. And by the middle of next year, they're all an aspect to each other. And I think that's really interesting because we're getting this, I think we're going to see a big shift away from this very excessively feminized feeling space of all of this wokeness, worrying about offending people, these attacks on masculinity. I think the pendulum's going to swing back really hard in the other direction. And you might think, oh, well, wouldn't that mean that masculinity is going to make a comeback? And it's like, well, it may make a comeback, but I'm not entirely sure that it will be a good one. And I say that because, as you say, what Aries represents, of course, is, that really raw and kind of aggressive, even destructive masculine in some cases. There's this, it's kind of like a caricature of masculinity almost in some ways. And so when the pendulum swings back that way, I think what we're going to get is a lot of chest thumping and a lot of LARPing at masculinity by people who are not really connected to what masculinity is in the primordial metaphysical sense. They will be acting out what they think a man should be, which is, loud and brash and aggressive. And I don't see that as being a good thing, because that's not a healthy masculinity. It's very reactionary. And so it is, because it's reactionary by nature, it's feminine. It's not, there's no principle in itself, right? It's just like, oh, we just don't like this pendulum swings, so we're now going to go the other way because it's opposite, not because of any real orienting belief in what masculinity is, but just to be reactionary. And that I don't think it's going to give us better results. I think it's just going to give us another set of problems.
Yeah. That's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. You're right about the other conjunctions that are taking place with Uranus and Gemini and all of that. I was very worried. And you're quite right. There's still a case to be worried, but there might be a kind of a diminution of the negative masculinity. I call that chivalric masculinity. Thinking historically, thinking along the lines of Evola. See, I don't know. Have you ever heard of Erich Neumann?
I feel like the name is familiar, but I couldn't place it off the top of my head.
Well, he was a Jungian, right? And I wrote a book based on his work on the child, which never got properly published. So I used it in a book I have got called Dragon Mother, and it goes into these types of and one of the types, it has the feminine female, it has the masculine female, it has the masculine male, and it has the chivalric male. There's these different types that I go into. So this chivalric male, who's basically parody of masculinity, as you're speaking about, that would definitely fit the Aries. I hadn't thought about that before. And so the Neptune coming in there does look like it will affect that, affect it. And one would hope then that out of the ashes of that would come a more sensible imago. And I don't think we can look to women to be championing it or inculcating it, but it's just possible, now that you've got my mind going in that direction, that kind of masculinity might be the result of some of the manosphere and the red pilling and the MGTOW. Mm-hmm. Not as we see it perhaps now, but I'm looking forward here right now. Let's hope that that's the case. What do you think?
Well, when I talk about masculinity with people, I tend to break it up into two different categories. So I use the terms the heroic masculine and the phallic masculine, or heroic man and phallic man. And the heroic man is what Evola's conception of masculinity is, and what the ancient conception was, which is, being a principle unto yourself, being internally self-sufficient, having a quality of stillness, of detachment, of it's very calm, right? It's the unmoved mover. But phallic man is driven by sex. He's driven by all of his desires and his cravings. So maybe you have seen some people online who talk about the longhouse. Are you familiar with that meme?
No.
The longhouse is this idea that women are basically trying to control men. And what actually happens is men put themselves in the longhouse. Women don't do it. Excuse me. Women don't do it to them. It happens because he is not a master of himself, because he is so ruled by his cravings and his desires that he's constantly seeking outside of himself, and often seeking in a very hedonistic and self-gratifying way. He's not aiming for anything higher. So if you consider the nature of reality, the realm of becoming, which is feminine by nature, the material realm is feminine. That's a very natural place for women to exist in, because we embody that principle. We don't have to work through that to become something more in the way that a man does. But for a man, because he's the embodiment of being, this realm is a lot more uncomfortable for him, and he's a lot more likely to either succumb to it, to fall further into illusion, and to just become a victim of it. And that's the phallic man. But the heroic man looks at that and says, this is not an acceptable state for me to be in. I do not accept being a slave to my desires. And he seeks to master that in himself. And in doing that, he cultivates that gravitas and that stillness and detachment within him. And that is the type of masculinity that is extremely hard to find today. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of men that I've met in my lifetime that I would say are, excellent examples of that. I have met plenty of men who maybe are examples of that to greater or lesser degrees, but very few who like really fully embody that. And in the Kali Yuga, the masculine principle is said to be asleep. So it's not really surprising. And it's not anything. I don't want to make this sound like I'm attacking men for this, because it's not really their fault. It's just the nature of the age that we live in.
That's interesting, because do you know how long it will take Neptune to go through Aries?
Off the top of my head, I wanted to say it's more than 10 years. I know that.
Yeah. See, that's interesting, because even though then this thing we're talking about reigns for that length of time, that's only a blip in history. So there's something to look forward to, that the other kind of masculinity that you're speaking about, and I agree completely with what you're saying, and I've written extensively on that, it might actually start coming in, not when we have this present conjunction, but after that. Let's just hope. Now, what you're talking about in terms of the heroic, the duad between the heroic and the phallic, is the central issue of a great thinker. I have a whole website dedicated to him, Otto Weininger. Have you've come across his work, of course?
I have, yes. He was very influential on Evola.
Right. People can we can hook up David to ottoweininger.org, my site, later on. Well, also before Weininger was William Blake, the English poet, who spoke of this ultra feminization of man, and that if he doesn't awaken from it and choose the vertical, and he didn't think that being a phallic identity was the answer either, but if the man does not strive for this Martian sort of phallic aspect, he would have looked at maybe Leo as being a much more, positive masculine archetype, or perhaps even Sagittarius, because Blake himself was a Sagittarius, rather than the Aries, which I think is more brutal, like you're saying. But in any case, unless the male strives vertically to get out of this sort of, the way he put it would be a kind of a, well, he used many metaphors, but a kind of a swamp-like existence in the lunar feminine world, we're doomed. Civilization for Blake at that point was would never be restored, and he had dedicated his work, you see, to drawing pictures of what this masculinity. He tried to embody it himself, and he spoke extensively of it in his own work. So for me, Blake, Weininger, and Evola, just to mention it, I would say people who are interested in this should definitely look into all of their work. So now, do you know how Evola himself got into this subject matter? I know he knew René Guénon, but can you fill us in on maybe a little bit of his background, how he steered in this direction? Because a lot of people just think of him as some sort of right-wing nut. He wasn't. He wasn't a Nazi, and he wasn't a nut.
No, his politics are downstream from his metaphysical beliefs, and that was always much more important to him. He's pretty quiet about his own biographical data. So like how and why he kind of was attracted to these ideas. I suppose we could look at his birth chart for clues, but he didn't really say a whole lot about like his early years in terms of like, we don't know if like as a child he read some book that opened his mind or something like that. But he did have this lifetime commitment to expounding these metaphysical doctrines, and his political activism, I think, it was very much a product of his time, because you have to consider the era in which he lived in, World War II and the time after that. And he was kind of looking to see whether or not the Germans or the Italians, what they were doing would be a sufficient vehicle for tradition. And he ultimately concluded that it wasn't. It was too populist, that they were going too much in the wrong direction towards this downward democratic aim, which he was very much against. And so after that, he became focused on trying to sort of build up this sort of like esoteric elite that could maybe guide the culture a little bit more. And I think a lot of it was maybe, I think some of it was maybe driven by a sense of duty. He always, at the end of his life, he wanted to be able to say, done is what needed to be done. And he, by all accounts, he was quite a charismatic powerhouse of a magician. So it sounds like he had at several points in his life that he was surrounded by groups of people who were equally interested in these ideas and wanted to find a way to influence the culture. But I think ultimately he kind of came to the realization that this is just the nature of the Kali Yuga. Like, we can't stop it. We can't put the brakes on it. This is the Kali Yuga is a fated part of history, and it's a necessary part of cyclical time. That shouldn't be forgotten. And I think a lot of the discourse today around politics, because most modern people are, of course, very attached to the idea of linear time. They think we need to do this now, and we need to make progress, and we need to see results, and they don't appreciate the Kali Yuga for what it is. Like, it's subjectively unpleasant for us to have to live in it, of course. Nobody needs to have a good time with it. But that stage, that dissolution, that solidification, that descent into the darkness, into the yin principle, is required so that the masculine principle can then violently reawaken by reacting against itself and then seeding the next golden age. And so we have to get to a point of, near total dissolution. We have to get to a point where it looks like there's absolutely no way that the masculine principle could ever be revived. And then suddenly, Shiva decides to wake up. And
but that's how I
changes.
read. That's interesting, because that underlines what I was just saying about Neptune and Aries. Neptune is the sign of the last. It's the ruler of the last sign, Pisces. So the fact that it's in the first house, the last and the first coming together like Alpha and Omega, maybe after it passes out, that is going to be the end of that phase, and we do begin a new phase. Because it just seems to me very, very odd that placement. It's not necessarily good in the short term for what we know as masculinity, but there's a quality of Neptune that washes out as well as dissolves, washes out illusion, washes out toxicity, so to speak. So there is a glimmer of hope in all of that. But I had 3 questions. I don't know if I may ask you those.
Sure.
And that is, what was his general take on Nietzsche first?
His main disagreement with Nietzsche is in regards to immanence. Nietzsche's, and I'm not an expert in Nietzsche, so, I may get some things wrong about him because I'm not, Evola's my wheelhouse more than Nietzsche. But Nietzsche's view of the Übermensch was more of just like this very forceful will, right? And that's not really what Evola's getting at. Immanence is a fundamental principle of the Hermetic arts, which he was very interested in, first of all. But this idea that, the superior man is not just somebody who has a strong will, but somebody who has made a genuine connection with the divine, and through that connection has become changed on an ontological level. That's why he's a heroic man, to use my term. Evola doesn't use that term. I should probably clarify that. That's just something I have coined. That is, but he did like Nietzsche. I mean, he was influenced by Nietzsche. He does reference Nietzsche fairly frequently in his books. And I think, Nietzsche he recognized the problem of the loss of spirituality, but he didn't necessarily have a transcendent reference point for his philosophy, which is, maybe why he went a little bit nuts.
And also, he did, as a pagan slant, worship Dionysus, but Dionysus is by no means a positive masculine figure. One could even argue quite the contrary. So there was something a little bit off balance there. It would be my opinion. to select Dionysus in isolation from all the other gods is bizarre, because you can't. It's a pantheon. And then to select that particular god from the rest is also not without its difficulties. You know, one could speak endlessly about that. And you're right. This idea of the over materialization and the immanence would have irritated Evola, because you need the transcendent.
It was all about the transcendent connection for him. Like, without that, philosophy is hardly worth doing.
It sounds like Nietzsche would be one of your phallic men. He would fall more under the umbrella of that. Maybe not exactly in the middle, but certainly under that umbrella, rather than he would the heroic, actually. I think that you've contextualized it very well.
Well, I think to kind of maybe put a finer point on it, a phallic man isn't, the low-hanging fruit to characterize that is kind of like, the Andrew Tates of the world, right? But it's not just something that overt. It's any man who has not mastered himself internally, any man who is still a slave to his own cravings and desires, any man who cannot say no to those things. Whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be something. It doesn't have to be something sexual necessarily. It could just be a case of, like, when you eat a piece of cake, it's so good you just can't say no to eating the entire cake, right?
Yeah. I would add
that might be a problem I have.
No, I think you're perfectly right, and I would add one thing only, and that's been almost a motto for me in my work on this subject, and that is that the masculine man knows women. The unmasculine man can be defined strictly, and this is along Blakean and Weininger lines, that ignorance of what makes the female tick and what is the. I mean, you know as well as I do that most people in today's world, the hipster generation, doesn't even know the difference between masculinity and maleness, or femininity and femaleness. They equate the two.
Yes.
Damn it. Doesn't that?
It is so. That is so frustrating to me. Thank you. I feel seen.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So that's the level we're on. Evola wouldn't have even predicted that. It's that bad. But I'm thinking that the man who is starting to initiate himself, first just by simple observation, there's nothing intellectual required, into what is going on with womankind, not waiting for woman to disclose it, because that will never happen. They have to start observing it in this dispassionate way. The beauty that you talked about of the quietness, the stoicism of the higher male, he needs to utilize it this way. And once that starts and he's self-initiated into discovery of the mystery of what woman is, then I believe that is the catalyst, to the healthy masculinity that then can fight the dragon of this phallic level that he's caught in. That's Seneca said that once the man is old enough to be free of sexual desire, it's like being freed from service to a madman. And of course, we can see the logic in that. But in general, the masculine man, it's not that he's asexual or deviant in sexuality in any way, or necessarily renunciate, but he is certainly not also the slave then of this mystique that women pervade and that has enslaved man for so many centuries. He's no longer the victim of that. He's freed himself from that.
Right. And once he's free from it, then he can enjoy it as a just pleasure. And I think like what you're saying with that about them not understanding the difference between man versus masculine or woman versus feminine and equating the two, like, this is a big problem, because you have so many people who think like, well, this is what men do, so it must be what masculine is. And it's like, but men and women today are not exemplars of their sex. They are very degraded. And so it's not really appropriate to look at it like that. And I think in terms of with men freeing themselves from these chains of sexual urges and fascinations, like, one of the reasons that I wanted to do the audiobook of Eros and the Mysteries of Love is because it's so important to this constant gender discourse that seems to go on. And this, like, just read this book. You will understand so much better what masculine and feminine actually is and how to relate to the opposite sex as a result. But what you also learn is that as a man, you know, you have the feminine within you too, just as women also have a masculine within them. And I'm not a Jungian, but I like his terms, anima and animus. I do like to use those concepts because I think they're very illustrative of this. For the man to become the heroic man, he's essentially overcoming what's feminine within him, but he's not repressing it. And that's the key thing. And you'll sometimes see like some things that are really popular among like the more like manosphere types and stuff is talking about things like semen retention and like no FAP November and stuff like this. And Evola is actually really clear in Eros and the Mysteries of Love that this sort of like repression of the sexual urge is not the way to go. That causes a lot of other problems. What you have to actually do is strengthen yourself against it, to be non-reactive to it. And this is where I think meditation comes in handy, because you learn to observe your thoughts, your feelings, and you notice them arising within you. But then you also notice that actually you do have a conscious choice as to whether or not to run away with those thoughts and feelings that have arisen. You don't have to give them airtime. And once you can make that choice, now you could stimulate yourself with as much sexual input as you wanted, and you just use it essentially as a way of sharpening yourself against it, of withstanding the onslaught and remaining in your stable center without becoming swept away by it or reacting to it in any way. And that's what differentiates the heroic man from the phallic man, because the phallic man would encounter some kind of, he encounters the fascination of woman, and he just falls into it. It has this vertiginous quality for him. And we all know a man who's like lost all sense of reason as soon as he's fallen in love with a beautiful woman. And that's not really what we want to see as far as masculinity goes. We want to see a man who can appreciate that, but who is in control of it. And that's just not something we see a lot of examples of today. So, of course, we can't really expect men to know how to do that.
And your original point holds, because it's not that he becomes enthralled. Sorry, it's not that the woman necessarily is out to enthrall him. I think many women are out for that. But it's also more about him allowing himself to be enthralled, is the way you put it when we start talking. And that needs to be borne in mind. Now, one thing about... when you spoke about Nietzsche's will and the lack of the transcendent, we have replaced that here on Unslaved. We've talked a lot about the ache of longing, and the difference. It's just the difference between desire and will, and that the higher man for us here on Unslaved is a man who has awakened desire in a purer form than the will. And we've tried to, go through podcasts where we discern the difference between the two, because again, those have been fused together as if they're the same thing. They're not. The will need not have a transcendent quality, whereas the desire does. It already comes with it, and it can be enhanced. And it's enhanced by what I've called the ache of longing. And this is a longing that is not necessarily with a direct object, in the same way that normal human ambition and this phallic drive would have. It's for the transcendent and the ineffableness of the transcendent, and the awakening of that desire would be the mark of the masculine man. Now, leading on from that, it leads me to ask you the second question I had, which was, what was his relationship with Plato?
He does cite Plato a lot. Like quite frequently. So obviously he was familiar with him. I think Plato is kind of essential reading if you want to understand traditionalism, because there is a lot of traditionalist qualities to Plato's writings. I don't think I've ever come across any criticism of Plato by Evola. But one thing to keep in mind is that Evola is very careful not to give his own opinions on things. He will occasionally make a dig at like maybe another thinker that he doesn't really like or something like that. And it's usually pretty subtle, but he generally limits himself to simply being descriptive or giving a possible interpretation. And if he's giving an interpretation that is kind of just based on his own spiritual intuition or something, he's always really careful to state that that's what he's doing. It's a bit difficult sometimes to get a read on like what he might have personally thought about a given writer or thinker. But I think just based on the frequency with which he cites Plato, I think we could probably say that he was definitely a Plato appreciator.
Good. Yeah, that's right. That makes a lot of sense. And what sign was he, by the way?
He's a Taurus, 9th house Taurus, Virgo rising.
You know what day?
Well, let me
We
just
can always
pull up
look
his
it up
birth
later.
chart and check. He was born on May 19th, 1898.
Late
I
Taurus,
did manage
then.
to get a copy of his birth chart. So it was recorded for 12 noon, which is probably a rounded off time. But I've looked at his chart many, many times, and I think at least using whole sign houses, which I do, it's workable enough for me.
Oh yeah.
He's also a Taurus moon.
Oh, he was.
Yeah. Taurus, Sun, Moon, and Mercury.
Wow, look at that for a chart. And of course,
With a
he's just few days-
Venus-Neptune conjunction in Gemini, which might explain Eros and the mysteries of love.
Yeah, look at that. And Neptune in this regard would be the mystical aspect, wouldn't it? The metaphysical interest.
Yeah, I kind of take a different interpretation of the outer planets than I think is typical. And I wonder if this Neptune-Venus conjunction maybe gave him a little bit more insight into the nature of the feminine, simply because I consider all of the outer planets to be representative of the abyssal qualities of the feminine, of Maya, of becoming. And Neptune in particular relates to the fascinating quality, like in Eros, Evola describes the nature of the feminine as having this sort of like seductive, magical, like it's magnetic almost, right? It draws a man in. Like it's like Narcissus looking over into the pond, right? And he's looking at his reflection coming back to him. And then he falls in because he's so in love with his reflection. And the real meaning of that myth is non-different from the same as, the Eastern creation myths, where Shiva glanced at Shakti and then creation starts to unfold, right? There's a way in which the masculine principle on its own, having no power of its own, but only being able to direct it, to impose a pattern, a will, upon looking at the feminine, sees its own potential and says, if I could manifest myself in creation, I can achieve my full flowering too. And this is part of the reason that the masculine falls in love with that fascinating quality of the feminine, because the feminine is reflective like the moon, and it's mirroring back to the masculine what it could become if only they were united. And so to me, Neptune has that quality, is representative of that very fundamental essence of the feminine that is, because Neptune's associated with things like illusion, but also things of a very like spiritually transcendent nature as well. And it's kind of like, how do you reconcile those two things? Because usually if you're doing like a trip to get to spiritual transcendence, you're trying to get away from illusion, right? You're trying to strip that away and see the true reality. So there's something very interesting about Neptune like that. And when I look at that in Evola's chart, I can't help but wonder if a Venus-Neptune conjunction would have given him this particular interest in that sort of study of not just sex, but also he wrote on sex magic as well. And may have even practiced it before he was paralyzed, for all we know. We know he had a number of girlfriends, at least, though he wasn't the marrying type.
Right. And the dyad, this dyad is there with all of the planets. It just becomes more intense with these larger planets, that they have these different sides. And Evola, for me, is himself also not just a manifestation of the higher masculine. He himself embodies the higher feminine. And as an adjunct to what you're saying, he would be attractive to certain high level women in the same way that a man might be attracted erotically to a woman. So he represents something that the female finds specifically attractive, a mystique of his own that somebody like Elvis may have had on a certain level. Very few men would have it, though. And that he had a mystique of his own, and therefore was in a position to know exactly how it is in the reverse situations where men get deeply enthralled by the woman and the dangers that brings. He, I believe, also had this quality that women found immensely attractive in a way that they would not have known in his presence, that they wouldn't have known in the ballroom, or the salon, with the rest of the aesthetes or the average politician or smartass, that they were meeting in the world. We know that Nietzsche was a tremendously frail person, was hopeless in that regard. And, so I'm sure you get what I'm saying. He had a kind of a enigmatic quality that's only found in certain, celebrities or rock stars or whatever. You can think of the girls in the beginning when they saw Elvis or the Beatles or something like that. I think Evola had that, but not to a bunch of idiot chicks. He had it to high masculinized women. In the same way that maybe
I think he was a very integrated person. I mean, he's an ascetic. He's done a lot of the self-work on himself. And I can kind of tell just by reading, especially like his intro to magic books and such, or, Doctrine of Awakening and whatnot, he has a genuine understanding of these things, like an experiential understanding. It isn't just theory for him. He's done the inner work. He has integrated the feminine within himself. And I always find it funny because sometimes I will encounter people who are like, Evola hated women. He was a misogynist. And when I read what he says about women, I think not only is this his description of what the feminine is, not only does that resonate with me, but I also think that it's one of the most flattering and uplifting ways to describe women in terms of helping us reorient toward our own nature and purpose in a way that is in line with tradition and is fundamentally going to lead us to internal wholeness ourselves. But I think a lot of what he says just kind of rubs modern sensibilities the wrong way.
Yeah, of course it would. And also it's just the easy way out. He was a high intellectual, and it's the easy way out to just demean him as they did Nietzsche and Hegel and other thinkers are immediately right-wing nutters or whatever, proto-fascists and what have you. One question I had was, do you know, because he was so deeply into the occult, are you familiar with any connection that he had with Rudolf Steiner?
He was not a very big fan of Rudolf Steiner and is quite critical of him in the book, depending on who it's published by. If it's Inner Traditions, it's The Fall of Spirituality. If it was the old Arctos edition, it's The Mask and Face of Contemporary Spiritualism. There's a whole chapter in there on anthroposophy, and he's pretty critical of Steiner.
Interesting. Yeah, that's very, very interesting. Of course, Arctos is on the side of Steiner, right? They tend to take a more Steinerian view.
I'm not sure about that. I couldn't speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I know that they publish a lot of books by Jason Giorgiani.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I haven't followed Jason's work, and it's been a few years since I heard of anything he was doing, so I'm not quite caught up with what he's maybe interested in these days.
Yeah,
so
I know he's busy. Do you know that he's busy he's trying to gain funds to build a statue of Prometheus on Alcatraz Island? Are you familiar with that project?
No, I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, that's what is taking up a lot of his time right now. It seems to me a rather bizarre project, but they're looking for millions. He's found the designer. He's working with the actual designer, sculptor, so to speak, and they're actually hoping that under the Trump administration, they will get permission to build this colossus in the harbor, San Francisco harbor. To me, it just sounds utterly bizarre, but you never know, it might happen.
Yeah, I don't know. I remember Jason Giorgiani thinking like he's such an interesting thinker. I don't agree with most of what he says, but I'm always interested in what he has to say just because he's intelligent and he's got unusual ideas, and I'm very attracted to unusual ideas even if they're wrong, just because I like to see how people think and make these
Oh, yeah.
connections. And sometimes I learn something that I didn't know.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, we have had him on the show mostly to talk about Heidegger, but of course it never stays on the subject. Jason can barely stay on his subject without going off on another tangent. But we
Well, he
did have
knows
him on
about
to
so
speak.
many topics.
Yeah. And we did have him on to speak about the Colossus book that he did, Iranian Leviathan, which I think is a masterpiece. That is absolutely a masterpiece, that book. Highly recommended. We're going to do a book list, podcast down the line, and it'll for sure include that book, Iranian Leviathan. I can't say enough about it. What a fantastic history.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah. And of course, I mean, just the very fact that his key idea that one day Iran will overthrow the mullahs and be a democratic free country again, and also a bastion of Aryanism. I'm with all of that. I mean, to me, that's absolutely, I'm on board with that completely. That's something that needs to happen ASAP. So, yeah, that it's an essential platform that he's advocating there,
Yeah.
Now, Evola, I know two questions. One is, what was his connection with the German Romantic movement? Because there's certain things he liked and certain things he didn't. What's his take on Romanticism?
That is a little bit outside my wheelhouse because I'm not particularly interested in the Germans, so I haven't really delved that much into that part of his work and connections with that kind of stuff. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, unfortunately.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's only because in my work I've connected the Romantics as not wittingly, but unwittingly, they were the progenitors of the woke movement. And this is I hold to that. One reason is because right now there seems to be on the internet a lot of disinformation being put out about the origins of the woke movement, and some thinkers have actually they would be on the conservative side, have tried to link it back to Hegel of all people, and this I cannot accept. There's aspects of Romanticism in Hegel. There's no doubt about it, as there were in all those thinkers at the time. But to choose Hegel over the other Romantics is bizarre to me. And of course, we have the phenomenon of the left Hegelians that led to Marx and Feuerbach. Also, I would say, is more evidence. There's more evidence of that being, well, clearly, right? Marxism is more of a progenitor of what we have today than anything to do with Hegel proper. So there was just that little anecdote there. But then that leads me to the other question. Are you familiar what Evola thought of existentialism in general as a philosophy?
He was not a fan of it. He's not really a fan of any of these modern philosophies as a general rule because, like, as I said before, they're all lacking a transcendent orienting point. And they're all basically, like the modern world loves to try to rediscover what the ancient people already knew and then repackage it without any of its spiritual connection points and pretend that they've found some new intellectual solution to humanity's problems. And so
Right.
all of these sort of modern philosophies, Evola is not going to be a fan of any of them because that's essentially what they're all doing. They're not orienting to something transcendent. They're just the products of the rational mind from people who are very degenerated and cut off from tradition and are just fumbling around in the dark, essentially. So
Yeah.
he has, anything that you could classify as modern, he's going to be very critical of, and and of course he takes a longer view of what's modern than the average person might, because that goes back to the start of the Kali Yuga. So, even like ancient Rome was technically still modern.
That's right. It's the way you look at it. Yeah, in terms of the greater historical movement. Now, in general, then, because I think of him as a thinker in the Western mystical tradition, but you earlier mentioned some Eastern, the Shiva and the Shakti idea. What was his take on Eastern? Was he more leaning toward that Hinduism because of its caste system? What was his general take on the Eastern system? Was he in favor of it?
I wouldn't say that he's like in favor of or opposed necessarily, so much as that he is looking for the common threads that point back to the primordial truth. And if he can't find those in a Western tradition, he's going to look for it in an Eastern tradition. And in many cases, some of the Eastern traditions are, they're less contaminated by modernity in some ways, I guess you could say. And so and this isn't like, we shouldn't confuse this with some type of syncretism. It's not like picking and mixing so much as it is like, where do we see these common themes? And if we see all of these common themes across all these different traditions, what does it mean? What is it pointing towards? What is the real truth behind these traditions that they're all kind of giving their own interpretation of, that is colored by, the era in which it arises or the culture in which it arises and so forth. So he did see a lot of value in many of the Eastern traditions. And I mean, obviously, because he wrote entire books on some of them, but he wasn't like advocating for people to take up any of these particular pathways, because his view was that all modern spiritual traditions are too degraded.
Yeah. So he wasn't. Yeah, exactly. Now, what about the caste system then? I know he pointed to that as being something that shouldn't have ever been dismantled. Is that right?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that's what our next episode is going to be, which I've already started working on. So this one I can answer for you. His focus on the caste system has to do with it being a part of a traditional hierarchy. So one of his big critiques of modernity is this downward democratic leveling, right? Like, we all have to be squashed down to the level of the lowest common denominator, because we all have to be equal. Nobody can be better than anyone else. And the caste system, I think, the way that it's presented today is very, I guess you could say, it's very unfair, and it is often the product of just ignorance. What Evola is saying about the caste system, and what you'll find other traditionalists saying about it as well, is that the caste system is meant to reflect a primordial hierarchy, and it reflects it between these various categories of people, not based on, like their physical characteristics, like, it's not like the race of the body, but it's based on their relative degree of distance from pure being or pure spirit, right? Their distance from God, essentially. And not all people are equal in their spiritual potential or in their social capacity, right? Different people have different talents. They have different responsibilities. And so a caste system is meant to ensure that each individual is able to fulfill their dharma, their essential nature, so that they can kind of fully blossom into their full potential as a human being, but also to fulfill their spiritual destiny and to contribute to the greater good in a way that is both meaningful and appropriate. And the modern objection, of course, is, well, what if somebody doesn't want to do their assigned role in society? People should just get to choose what they want to be. Well, what people want to do is usually at odds with their own spiritual growth. It's usually, what people want to do is usually much more aligned with pursuing material pleasures. And this hierarchy, this isn't some invention of humans. It's a natural part of the cosmos. It's part of fundamental reality, in the same way that, if you like Did you ever do that science experiment in school where you have you pour oil and water together, and then you see how they separate, and the or the oil rises to the top of the water or whatever? The lighter
Yeah.
fluids kind of float to the top of the denser ones. It's kind of like that. That's what the caste system is like. It's just this impersonal cosmic law. It's not suggesting that one type of person is necessarily better than somebody else, because all of the people within the caste system are necessary. And Evola would say that a person of a lower caste who fulfills their role perfectly would be superior to someone of an upper caste who isn't fulfilling theirs perfectly. And so the reason that a person would be born of a specific caste is because they possess a transcendently different type of spirit than somebody of a different caste. It's more like, birth isn't determining nature, but nature determines birth. You are born into a certain caste because your fundamental nature fits that. Now, of course, in the modern age, with all the various mixing of the castes, this is no longer a relevant benchmark. But you have essentially, you basically have a system where, you're trying to get people into the right spot in society that will allow them to flourish and let their full nature really blossom, their true fundamental essence. So if you have the soul of an artist, is it not better for you to be born into the artisan caste, into a family of artists who will teach you that craft from a young age so that your soul can express itself through your craft? If you have the soul of a priest, is it not better for you to be born into the priestly caste so that your life is one that is entirely dictated by ritual purity and you are fulfilling your spiritual goal in the way that is most appropriate to your inwardly ascetic nature? Of course that would be. And instead, what we have in modernity is people who are, 30 years old and still don't know what they want to be when they grow up. People who have all this existential angst over their purpose in life. Well, the caste system solves that. You know what your purpose is. You know what your role is. You have meaningful duties, meaningful connections with other people in society, and you're not wasting your life and your energy trying to figure out what you want to be when you grow up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely well put. I wanted to ask you, you talked about the democratization and how it affects even the gender wars right now. I want to get to that. But first, let's stick on the theme. What is the transcendent then to him? Because there's not just one theory of that. What you've said so far, even about society and the caste system, is very Platonic, because Plato had this tripartite demarcation. And
almost every traditional civilization had some form of a caste system broken into either 3 or 4 parts.
Right. Exactly. One could argue it's even in the Old Testament. So, but again, in terms of transcendence, what were his religious beliefs, or what was it that he tried to bring philosophically to that whole scheme?
So he is talking about specifically an upward transcendence. So we kind of have to distinguish that from this more downward transcendence that is a sort of dissolution. This is a transcendence that is, he calls it the Olympian leap. It's a liberation. This is the type of transcendence that a lot of the Eastern religions propel one towards through their methods. It's an overcoming of the material nature, of one's lower nature. And in doing so, one becomes more godlike. One becomes more aligned with what is divine, with what is higher. And it's not the same type of transcendence, for example, and I hate to even use the word transcendence to describe this sort of downward transcendence, because I think it causes confusion for people. But it's not the same thing as if you were to just go and drink ayahuasca and have some profound experience that feels transcendent, but it's not really, because it's actually kind of pulling you more into materiality or even into illusion in some cases. And that's not what he's talking about. It isn't like some pathos. It's not some feeling. It's an actual state of being that is categorically and ontologically different from profane material existence. I don't know if that actually answers your question sufficiently or not.
Yeah, and but it's not Gnostic. It would be
No,
more Hermetic.
no. Yes, correct.
And there's a God involved, right?
Yes. As for his like specific beliefs, like he did not subscribe to a particular religion. As I said before, he considered all of these paths to be degraded and that they are not sufficient to offer the type of liberation that he's looking for. Because he's looking for the ultimate liberation, like the Buddha, right? He wants the ultimate overcoming of everything to reach the unconditioned. And most modern day religions don't offer that, especially like the devotional forms of religion do not offer that. The Abrahamic religions are very salvation based, right? You're waiting for the Messiah to come and save you. It's very passive. He is very active in his spiritual orientation, that this is something that you need to take charge of and that you must do, although he is quite clear that this is not a path that is suitable for most people, we could say. And his, part of his study of all of these different myths and religions and traditions and everything like that is him trying to find what are the threads that link back to a primordial Hyperborean spirituality. Like he's very big into like the solar and the polar symbols and stuff, and he strongly distinguishes that against these more southern strains of spirituality that are more earth-based and oriented towards the feminine and towards matter. He's oriented away from that. He wants pure spirit.
Yeah. We've spoken a lot here in my work about the Arctic homeland and its relevance to the Vedas and the ancient scriptures, and even to the Grail mythologies and what have you.
Yes.
But now, just to go back to the caste system for a minute, he's saying then, in short, that even if you were born at the lowest caste, you not only in the doing world are doing the correct doing, as well as being, but just because you're low caste doesn't mean that you don't have direct access to the transcendent as much as the ones at the higher caste, right? Would I be right in saying that? Or is it just only the higher caste have the transcendent?
Well, there are many ways to approach the transcendent, and we have to be perfectly honest here and say that not everybody has the capacity to do that. In order to do that, it does require, a certain IQ level. You have to be able to deal with abstract concepts. You have to have a certain type of, spiritual intuition, which is not something that can really be quantified or measured, but you kind of either have it or you don't. So people of the lower caste are not going to be as rich in those types of things, although often there was a pathway for outliers to pursue their true nature if they found themselves in a caste that didn't allow them to flourish. But you would be like, for the priests, the priestly caste, they are dealing directly, they are the mediators with the transcendent. And their pathway is often going to be through ascesis, ritual, various types of what the Hindus would call sattvic living, right? Whereas for the warrior caste, they don't do those kind of rituals. They don't have to, and they're not required to, but they find their transcendence through the battlefield, through the ability to practice detachment on the battlefield, to fight without regard for life and limb, because it's their duty to do so. Much like Krishna told Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, pick up your weapons and go fight because you're a warrior, and this is your chance to show your quality. This is your chance for glory. And I've already decided who's going to live or die. Do you want your transcendence or not? Because this is how you get it. And so that would be the path for the warrior. And each caste kind of has their own ways of doing this. And for the lower castes, they are going to be more oriented towards just a purely devotional, exoteric religion. And that isn't to say that there's no spiritual value in that for them, but it's more of, that there maybe not, it's not really a direct path. Like the type of heroic overcoming that we're talking about is not really open to the lower castes. Not because it's being kept from them, but because their very nature renders them incapable of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's not as far-fetched as it might first sound to people. They just need to look around in the world. So his view then on Christianity, what do you think of was his view on that?
He's pretty anti-Christian. He calls it the most profane of all religions. It's a religion that could only arise in the Kali Yuga. There are some people who will say that, oh, at the end of his life, he said Catholicism was the only hope for humanity. That I don't think that's what he meant by that. I think part of him saying that was due to the time he was living in and the political situation he found himself in post-war Italy. But also just in terms of, well, there's not going to be, he'd accepted by that point that there's not going to be some Hyperborean pagan revival. Because when he was very young, he wrote Pagan Imperialism, which was kind of all about that. And I think by the end of his life, he realized that was not going to happen. So his attitude towards Christianity, he would actually say that that's probably where wokeness started, was with Christianity. And I don't have anything against Christians or anything, because I think everybody needs to find their own spiritual path with what resonates with them. And, if that's what does it for you, then great. I'm glad when anybody finds a spiritual home for themselves. But in terms of how it fits in with actual traditionalism, it's very anti-traditional. And Evola even calls it subversive. So because it's undermining all of the qualities of traditionalism, it's undermining hierarchy, for example. This idea of universal love and brotherhood, and anybody can just get to heaven if they believe the right things. Like, that's not a traditional belief. It's like that was never before believed by anybody until Christianity came along. The idea that there's going to be, some definite beginning and end of the universe, the idea of linear time, is very Abrahamic, and that goes against the doctrine of cyclical time. Christianity has a tendency to kind of suppress the feminine rather than find a way to be in balance with it. It tends towards this very unhealthy dualism in some cases, depending on, the various sects that arose out of that. Some of them really kind of went heavy on the spirit good, body bad sort of thing. And Evola doesn't agree with that. So he has a lot to say about Christianity across a number of his different books. But in a nutshell, he considers Christianity to be actually one of the sort of key breaking points with the world of tradition in the age of the Kali Yuga. So prior to one of the first key breaking points in the Kali Yuga was what he calls the climacteric of civilizations, which is like the 8th to 4th centuries BC. And you had this series of spiritual crises running across all the civilizations of the world, which sometimes resolved more positively, sometimes more negatively. But it was a period in which the doctrines of tradition started to break down or be degraded or be corrupted in some way. And then the second breaking point that he identifies is the rise of Christianity and the fall of Rome. And then finally, the Middle Ages is the third and most decisive nail in the coffin, and that he also pins the blame for that largely on the Catholic Church. So I think Christians who are looking to Evola to validate their beliefs are going to be disappointed, although I still think that Christianity does have traditional elements to it. And Evola is very fair about that. He always gives credit where it's due. And he will point out where Christianity has been kind of a bastion of tradition or helped carry that torch forward in some ways. And then he'll point out where it has been subversive. And part of his thing with Christianity is that it's kind of a mixture of two spiritual traditions that are fundamentally at odds with each other, because it has, what happened in the Middle Ages and even before then is you have the pagan elements of Europe competing with the Semitic Christianity, which is more of a southern strain of spirituality. And they're reacting against each other. They're shaping and reshaping each other as they sort of battle it out. And as a result of Christianity's contact with pagan Europe, it changed Christianity. Like the Christianity of today would be unrecognizable to the primitive Christians. And so you have this European Christianity took on a lot of traditional elements that just due to the inevitable mixture and with the contact with paganism. And so in some ways, Evola would say that Christianity is beneficial in the sense that it guards against the lower. But the problem with it is that it has also closed the doors to the higher. And that's really his fundamental critique of it, is that it doesn't allow you to go higher. It shuts you off from the liberation that he's looking for. And what does it leave you with? It leaves you with only salvation and a devotional worship.
Yeah, so it's of a lower order ontologically, satisfactory to the masses, perhaps, but not to the higher man. Yeah, I think Blake would have agreed with that. What was the other point? Yeah, because we've been doing a series called Christianism, so that's why I asked you about that. And again, there's a collectivized aspect to all these religions. They're not going to really celebrate individualism in the Siddhartha Road in that overt way. They may pretend that they do, but ultimately, no, it's not particularly in favor of the individual own vision or journey, I think.
Yes. And I think, not everybody's at the same point in their spiritual journeys. And so for some people, converting to Christianity would be a step up for them. For other people like Evola, it would have been a step down. And so it really just depends where somebody's at, because as I said before, we're not all spiritually equivalent. And some people need different things. And one of the things that kind of bothers me about Christians sometimes is this proselytizing nature that they have, this idea that their religion is just this one-size-fits-all blanket solution for everyone's spiritual needs. And that's just simply not true, because there's plenty of people who didn't find what they were looking for in Christianity, but managed to find it elsewhere. And I think, if you believe in God, you believe in intelligent design, you believe that God has a plan for all of us, then God's plan for some of us is that we're not Christian. We're not going on that path. We deviate from that path. And I think that's okay, because there are many paths to truth. And I don't think there's any one religion that has a monopoly on it. I mean, I could find useful things to say about pretty much every religion I've studied, from, like Australian Aboriginals to Christians to Islam to Buddhism to whatever. There's always something of value there. And it's really just a question of what resonates with an individual person and where they're at in their journey. That's
right. Two other authors that jumped to mind when you're speaking there about this uneasy meeting of Eastern Christianity as it moved to the West was J.J. Bakofen. Are you familiar with him, the anthropologist?
Yes, I am so sad that more of his work is not translated into English, because my German is nowhere near good enough to read an entire book of his. But I have read what is translated, and I love it.
Yeah, he was essential. I like his work a lot. And Alfred Rosenberg also spoke of it, I think because he was influenced by Bakofen and Evola. But he also mentions it in his work that this, the original Christianity, which you're speaking, that might have come out of the Middle East, would have been unrecognizable as it was doctored to move to a Gentile Western audience. It also then has all of these other elements added to it that, Jews to this day don't even recognize what the hell it is going on. It's so hybridized. And others have,
yes,
shown that the culprit there was St. Paul. And I totally agree with that. Working for the Caesars, he utterly hybridized many traditions: Zoroastrianism, Gnosticism, Judaism, and even pagan elements with the sun king, sun god idea. And Evola, of course, took a given.
Well, and you can see why Evola would say that there is no spiritual path available in the modern age that provides a pathway to what he's looking for, which is, maybe why he was so big on the idea of self-initiation.
Right.
Not that he would recommend that for anybody else necessarily, but
well, that's right, and nobody should. I'm very attracted to that elitist part of his work. But coming back to this democratization, in how he regards the sexes, he spoke about a thing called the third sex, right?
Yes.
Could you speak to that a little bit?
So this is an essay in The Bow and the Club, which unfortunately I don't have the book handy because it's full of like great little quotes and stuff like that. I actually have on my YouTube channel. I recently posted an interview I did with a couple of people on the topic of the third sex, if anybody wants to kind of go deeper into that. Yeah. But basically, so in The Bow and the Club, he first starts off kind of talking about like the evasive man. And these are all like kind of the qualities of the modern man who's just like, he's flaky, he's deceitful. He doesn't have a strong inner center, right? And so the third sex is kind of, he's building off of this idea of these problems of the modern person. And one of the ideas that he kind of borrows from Otto Weininger, which he discusses in Eros and the Mysteries of Love, is this idea that when we're seeking a partner, like a sexual partner, we're looking for somebody who is our complement. So if you are 70% masculine and 30% feminine, you're seeking a partner who is 30% masculine and 70% feminine. You want those totals to add up to 100 roughly. And it is among those people who are the most complementary who will experience the greatest attraction of eros to each other. But the problem that we now have in the modern world is that the sexes are less and less differentiated, because one of the qualities of the Kali Yuga and of the feminine is to be undifferentiated. So now we have a whole bunch of people who are just kind of like not really strongly masculine or feminine either way. They're like not necessarily like androgynous as such. That's not what he means by the third sex. It's not an androgyne, but people who are sort of internally not really one thing or the other. And for that's kind of what he's referring to with the third sex. So this may be something that is kind of at the heart of a lot of the gender problems of today, whether that's, transsexualism to men and women hating each other, whatever the case may be. The polarity is being lost. And that polarity, that tension between the masculine and the feminine is fundamental to the cosmos. So what happens when that tension collapses? Well, nothing good. And when we see that happening between men and women in our day-to-day life, we see men and women who have their inner polarity has collapsed. Their polarity with each other has collapsed. This is reflecting a metaphysical reality that's happening on a higher plane, that the tension between the masculine and feminine on a cosmic level is collapsing as well. It's a sign that we're getting deeper into the Kali Yuga. Is there a solution to this? I mean, Evola is not one for offering solutions as such, other than to just, be a man among the ruins or ride the tiger. Like those are your two options, practically speaking. But with this kind of like third sex, these undifferentiated people, they're going to be very confused within themselves, right? It's just the same as if you don't have a caste. You don't know who you are. What's your orienting point anymore? Is it any surprise that we have transgenderism rising as a fad and all these young people who are like, I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl. What does that even mean? Well, that was never a question that needed to be asked before, because when people were still differentiated as men and women, we just knew what that was. We didn't need to have a conversation about it. So he's talking about the third sex almost as like it's a sign of the times, really.
Right, and look how valid and important that is. This lack of differentiation. Blake would have called it the ultra feminization. He had his own language for it, and what you're saying seems very consistent along those lines. And this there's something Yeah, it's interesting to frame it in terms of the larger cycles of the Kali Yuga. I hadn't really brought that to mind. We did have in the first year of Unslaved, we had a guest on speaking about that, the cycles of time, and we did go into the Yuga theory. It's interesting that Evola is also in favor of that theory, as a hermeneutical device to explain what's going on. Well, because one of the positives, again, we talked about it earlier in terms of astrology, is it leaves a window of hope that what is now will actually pass. These are cycles. So that's one thing. It's not just going to be there forever. But this gender dysphoria is enormous, and one can come at it from so many different angles as to why it is and what's going on. And in my Dragon Mother book and work, I speak of it, again, picking up on the Jungian aspects, that even just to speak of the chivalric man, but mostly even just the ultra-feminization is due to the condition of the fetus in the semiotic, the very, very pre-Oedipal situation in the womb, and then directly in the first few weeks or months after it. So we're not going to talk about it. I just wanted to mention it in passing that that's one theory of how you get this way. And then, sticking close to, I stick quite close to the theories of Freud, Jung, and Otto Rank. And that brings me to asking you a question about that. What was Julius Evola's take on psychoanalysis?
It was pretty negative. He considered it anti-traditional and subversive, as did Guénon. Which isn't to say, I feel like it's important to say this because a lot of people misunderstand this. That's not to say that all forms of psychotherapy and counseling fit that bill. He's not talking about it necessarily in a therapeutic sense. But the therapeutic value of it isn't what's in question so much as the fact that it's, there's a few there. I don't know how deep you want to go into this because I don't know how much time you have, but I could speak on it if you want.
Please.
Okay, so the traditionalist objection to psychoanalysis has a few parts. So first, there's this inconsistency with it where you're essentially handling elements of what are of a subtle and inferior order. And that's being accompanied by this totally materialist attitude towards it. So they're very ignorant of the elements that they're bringing into play. And this is very typical of modern sciences. They never really know the object that they're studying because they insist on always keeping it on a strictly corporeal plane. One of the issues with this is that psychoanalysis only considers the subconscious, but never the superconscious, which should be its logical correlative. It's only operating in this downward direction towards these lower infernal regions. And Guénon even said that this was opening, like it's aiming towards what he called these fissures in the world that allow malefic influences to penetrate. And of course, even the terms subconscious and unconscious seems to literally refer to a lower level, obviously. And so what tends to happen, because psychoanalysis isn't considering the existence of the superconscious, anything that is of a higher metaphysical, more profound order gets relegated to the subconscious. And this is kind of indicative of a tendency to run counter to spirituality. Because the only thing that can truly be profound is what is spiritual, what is touching the principle in the very center of the person. And so you have this confusion of the higher with the lower, of the superconscious with the subconscious, and so on. And this is part of what traditionalists make them consider psychoanalysis to be subversive. Now, maybe that's due to just ignorance and incomprehension on the part of some of them, but Guénon actually says that there are like bad actors who are intentionally doing this. I don't know if I entirely agree with that because he doesn't put forth a lot of like specific evidence for that, but I can understand why he is taking that view. So what you tend to get is like, for example, take symbols, right? Like Jung's very into symbols. And a lot of people like Jung for the work that he's done on symbols. But what tends to happen with psychoanalysis is they're taking these symbols in terms of just purely human elements, and they're failing to recognize what's essential in the symbol. And what's essential in it is something that has its origins and its roots in something eternal and cosmic and metaphysical, something in the higher upper realms, the suprahuman. And so these symbols that are only describing like kind of a more profane view of things, they're not really true symbols regardless of their outward appearances. And so those are getting mixed in with real symbols, and that's also creating further confusion. Now, one of the problems that they see with resorting to psychoanalysis in terms of therapy, and this is where it only becomes critical of psychoanalysis as a therapy, which isn't to say that they're also critical of other forms of therapy, because that doesn't factor into it. Like if you want to go see a counselor for like CBT therapy or something, that's a completely different story. That's not included in this. But for traditionalists, this is quite dangerous, both for the people who undergo it and for those who are applying it. And because it's tending to increase this disequilibrium in the world, because the effect of that is to bring the contents of these lower depths of the being to the surface, but it's doing so in a person who's already quite psychologically weak, because why else would they be in therapy? And so they're a lot less able to resist this chaos that's unleashed within them. And one of the things that I have heard as an analogy is like, well, isn't psychoanalysis just kind of like the descent into hell stage of an initiation? I don't know if you've heard that yourself, but that's something that I've been asked about, so I'll mention it. And it's not a correct analogy, because the two aims of initiation and psychoanalysis are very different. First is that you're dealing with two different categories of people. For initiation, you're dealing with somebody who's already extremely mentally strong. With psychoanalysis, you're dealing with somebody who's mentally weak. And secondly, in psychoanalysis, that descent is not followed by any reascent. What's happening is more akin to what the ancients called falling into the mire. And those who are said to have fallen into the mire were the people who claimed initiation but were unqualified to receive it. And so they were just considered to be victims of their own imprudence. With a descent into hell in the initiatic sense, the aim is to exhaust your inferior possibilities such that you are then able to rise into a superior state. But the fall into the mire is what happens when those inferior possibilities take possession over the person. They dominate him, and he ends up being kind of submerged completely into it. So like a classic example of this would be the person who's like endlessly pursuing self-improvement, but they never seem to get better, or for whom therapy maybe results in them becoming even more neurotic instead of less, because they start fixating on the things in their mind rather than overcoming them. So initiation has this aim of spiritual transcendence, and it's not intended to be or even suitable as a treatment for people who are mentally unbalanced, because a prerequisite for initiation is to be as perfectly internally balanced as possible before you undergo the initiation. And so psychoanalysis isn't a pathway for spiritual development in the same sense. What it's doing is developing this sort of inferior psychism, and it's kind of more akin to a sort of like a lower magic rather than what initiation is aiming towards. Now, the other aspect of why it's considered subversive traditionalist is because it is inverting what's called the doctrine of the two natures. The doctrine of the two natures is essentially just that fundamental polarity of masculine and feminine that underlies the world, or being and becoming, or sun and moon, or, however you want to conceptualize it. There are these two fundamental opposing natures. And so psychoanalysis is what it's uncovering regard to the subconscious. Like it's not new what they've uncovered. The subconscious was known to traditional ancient doctrines. So like, For example, in Buddhism or other yogic doctrines, they recognize multiple substrata even within the subconscious. They've got these concepts of like sankharas and vasana, and they have this precise methodology for how to deal with that. And this modern discovery of the subconscious within psychoanalysis tends to sort of conceive of it as being a distinct entity of its own. And so that's kind of creating this dualism within the human. It's especially if you're using the term unconscious instead of subconscious, because the unconscious isn't even really representing a reduced degree of consciousness so much as just a separate domain altogether. And so this splitting and substantialization of this part of the human being is very characteristic of what psychoanalysis does. It's treating the unconscious like its own entity with its own laws. And it's something that seems to almost always end up being victorious in a confrontation with that higher self. And so Evola's argument against that is that, this is an inversion because the higher should be dominating the lower, and psychoanalysis is not offering up any defense or means of control over the lower forces that it's bringing to the surface. It's tending to disavow even any idea of a sovereign spiritual center in man, where the unconscious is always the acting agent and the conscious is just merely acted upon by it. And there's not a lot left for the conscious principle to do except just act as an executor for whatever the forces of the unconscious are demanding. So these are kind of like the two fundamental problems that traditionalism has with psychoanalysis. It really kind of boils down to like, you're releasing these forces from below and you're not providing any way to dominate them, to control them, and to reassert the conscious self as the acting sovereign agent. So yeah, it's kind of like you're sort of taking the state of like modern man, it's quite difficult for him in his mental state to avoid that sort of abdication of the conscious self once psychoanalysis has opened his eyes, right? So for somebody like that, being ignorant of his unconscious could actually be a strength, just in the sense that just having an illusion of personal autonomy can still function as a basis for spiritual development. But once psychoanalysis strips that illusion away, like, how do you restore it? So Evola's verdict is, in general, what he would say is that apart from certain special cases of therapy, psychoanalysis is dangerous because it's not based on a discipline that's dedicated to creating a spiritual unity within the person. And it would only have a positive value in his view if it was preceded by some kind of asceticism. So he's not 100% disavowing it. Guénon 100% disavows it. Evola's kind of like leaving the door open for there to be some value to be taken from it, but he ultimately thinks it would be dangerous for the average person.
Wow, that's interesting.
Sorry for the TED talk. I hope it.
No, listen.
I hope it answered the question.
Oh, more than that, we couldn't have hoped to have a more insightful, because this is a very, very key area of their work. Is it true that René Guénon was a Catholic?
He actually became a Sufi later in life. I think he was born Catholic, though. Right.
Because that might play a part in his animus against psychoanalysis, although everything you're saying makes a lot of sense. And of course, they might point, say Jung's Red Book had been available at the time. I'm sure that they would have saw that exactly backing up, this sort of descent into the psychotic. They might have used that and said, look, here's exactly what we're talking about, the dangers that Jung himself nearly lost his mind, and had other psychotic episodes. It's well known that Jung himself, and I can see a case for this, because one can theorize that what good are your psychological models, right? I'm not speaking that I'm a believer in any of what I'm saying right now. I'm just pointing this out. If morning, noon, and night, your clientele, so to speak, have been the maddest people that our planet has produced. You've worked in the Salpêtrière in Paris. You've worked in the Burgholzsee in Switzerland as Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud. You spend all your days in madhouses, and your models and your theories of the psyche have come together from studying mad people, almost to and these are people, if they're not mad and in the institution, then they are clients who've come to see you. This is probably a little bit later, but they are still very troubled souls. So somebody like a Jean Paul Sartre or somebody would say, how can I trust these models when they've been formed out of studying specimens, some of the worst specimens, the ones who've already broken in their sanity? And I think there's a hell of a lot to that. There's no way of stepping past that. You've been studying the pathological. What?
Evola would agree with that.
You see that? Yeah. There's a lot to that. I've never articulated it before on the programs while we've been looking into these men, but it's something I've myself noted from way back in the 90s when I was reading Carl Jung. Now, there are other things that you could say in their defense, of course, especially about this idea of the transcendent. In terms of that, that's their own model, that Guénon and Evola are putting together, and one can then argue back and forth as to whether they are also subdividing in their own way the psyche. Jung has some very interesting things to say about us not actually possessing the psyche inside our minds, but that we are actually inside the psyche, and that is a very Berkeleyan transcendent idea. So he flits between us being containers of the psyche and yet saying that we are in fact contained within it. So he's a very ambivalent figure. I wonder, Evola would have had to write little pieces on each of these men, because you've got Alfred Adler, you've got Otto Rank, you've got Freud, you've got Jung. It would be interesting to see a better breakdown of each of them, but of course we don't have that, which is sad.
I think you would really enjoy his book, The Fall of Spirituality, because he has a whole chapter dedicated to a critique of psychoanalysis, as well as like anthroposophy and some of the other, and Catholicism and some of the other topics we've touched on. And he just kind of tracks with each of these different movements, like why it is contributing to a breakaway from the world of tradition.
And you said
it would be right up your alley. Yeah, published by Inner Traditions.
Okay, yeah, right. I'll definitely look into that. That's one I haven't read of his.
I think that book would be very perfect for you. Yeah. But I think like Jung and Evola were aware of each other. I don't know that they ever necessarily corresponded, but they certainly like commented on each other from time to time. And the interesting thing about people like Evola and Guénon and Jung and all these others is that they were able to have quite lively debates about these things. And even though I think they may have formed, very clear ideas about what the world of tradition thought about something, none of those issues were necessarily settled. They were still often debated between various thinkers. And so I think any discussion of like the topic of psychoanalysis always has to sort of create room for that. Like, it's important to note that these are not empirical subjects that you can develop these very inflexible conclusions about and expect them not to have any discrepancies.
Of course, it goes on and on. One way or the other, we've done work on the great Thomas Szasz, who is a great opponent of psychoanalysis. David, maybe we could link up to that one.
Sure.
Myth of mental illness, I think we called it after one of Szasz's books.
Yep.
And we also have a Conspiracy Against Freud, that podcast, so we can hook up to those. They're all relevant. And we have loads of on Carl Jung, so we can link up to those as well.
Yeah. I think when it comes to like, because I always was kind of interested in like depth psychology and stuff like that. But then I kind of came to realize that that's sort of what you get from meditation. And in a sense, meditation is, or at least certain types of meditation can be, a form of psychoanalysis where you are the analyst, where you are the one observing your subconscious contents and its connection to your behavior and emotions and your conscious thoughts. And if you can do that, do you really need a third party to subordinate yourself to abdicate to in order to tell you what's in your subconscious and interpret it for you. There's something about that has always kind of like bothered me a little bit, despite my interest. Like, I'm very interested in what's in the subconscious. I want to know, but there was always kind of something about having like this third party guiding the process that never quite sat right with me.
Well,
so like, if I don't know what's in my subconscious, how do you?
And in a strange way that's akin to quantum science, maybe their vision of me changes what is in my unconscious. So I'm not actually apprehending the real thing by way of this other alleged psychopomp, when in fact I am actually spitting in the face. Aleister Crowley would call it slapping your own guardian angel in the face. He would agree with what you just said. I am my own psychopomp. And if I turn to another, it's absolutely preposterous, because that person that I'm turning to should be bothered with their own psyche and not mine. So we have a major crisis here. And it's funny, to back up what you're saying, the greatest amount of literature that psychoanalysis has ever produced in and of itself concerns transference complex. More has been written on transference than any other topic in psychoanalysis. And transference means that the the therapist-client relationship, and how problematic it is. This writing started with Freud and continued almost ad infinitum because of exactly what we're talking about, the pitfalls and the difficulties. And I'm not just talking about the obvious one of a terrible therapist who hasn't really done his homework and he may have jumped through the hoops to get the degree, but he's incompetent as a human being. That one goes without saying, would be a problem. And then you're actually unfortunate enough to meet a therapist like that. That's an obvious one. No, they mean any therapist, even a very highly skilled one like Jung himself, being this kind of meddler, in which, where is the right in the very first place? Now, the right is because I'm paying the money and walking in there and saying, "Doctor, help me." Okay, so they have this right. But where is the metaphysical right? We may be doing something that is completely inauthentic. And this is what Karl Kraus thought, the great author. This is what Sartre thought. This is what Thomas Szasz thought. And they came down very, very heavily. In fact, Karl Kraus said that psychoanalysis is the cure for which it is really the disease.
Yes, and I think Evola would agree with that. And what you said about the suggestibility, he actually specifically mentions that as being a particular problem with it, especially because the types of people who are coming for psychoanalysis tend to be very suggestible people. And as you say, like, where's the metaphysical right for that? You kind of have this situation where the psychoanalyst is taking on this role of a spiritual master before his disciple, and he's actively intervening and helping his subject through this sort of psychoanalytic, quote unquote, mystery of self-sacrifice, and which of course has very little to do with traditional understandings of sacrifice. But with this technique of transference, you've got the ego not only opening the doors to its own underground, but it's doing so by abandoning itself to this other person. And Evola even said that Guénon was right to see something very diabolical in that, because Guénon actually refers to it as being satanic, which I think is quite harsh language. But as I said, like, I can understand where he got that. And this technique of transference is wide open to suggestion, and the subject having to come to they just come to acknowledge this truth of what the analyst has told him. And, when I consider this in context of, like, when I'm seeing astrology clients, for example, ethically, I feel I need to be very careful with what I suggest to somebody, because I don't know how that could affect them. I don't want to suggest that there's a possibility in their chart that may be a minute possibility, or I could just be wrong, right? I'm good at what I do, but I'm not perfect. And I don't want somebody to take my suggestion to heart and reorient their life around that. What if I gave them the wrong advice on that? So I'm always kind of like, there's a very fine line to walk when you're dealing with the contents of someone else's life and mind.
And when you're counseling, yeah, the responsibility is very heavy. And as I said before, it's
a big karmic entanglement with it.
Yes, yeah, there can be indeed. And I think it weighs on certain psychologists, and that's why they gave up doing it, or they wanted to radically transform what they were doing. This is certainly the case for Otto Rank and Carl Rogers. And Carl Rogers was so disturbed by this whole thing that he then developed a kind of psychoanalysis that basically repeats back to the client that which they are saying. And since most clients are inarticulate, it behooved the therapist to do it. But even when the client is articulate, the therapist was to say, so what I hear you saying is, and then they repeat back to the client what the client is themselves saying. And this whole thing was designed by Rogers to try and bypass some of this transference and countertransference, which at the grossest is just your parent. It's daddy and or mommy, sitting there and they're ersatz, and you are the child. And of course, don't forget that the early clients of psychoanalysis were almost entirely women. Men wouldn't be seen dead, right, coming for psychoanalysis. So
right.
It's mostly women lying passive on a bed, lying down on Freud's couch, and getting all their neurotic syndromes out into the open for a session. It's like, oh, what is this, a spa or something? So, an Otto Rank, who was Freud's secretary, had to greet these clients coming in, knew they were neurotic just by looking at them, and after 22 years formed his own form of psychoanalysis that again would address these matters that we're talking about, and kind of show some of the pitfalls here. Because of the suggestion, he would just to make it short, he would just say that, look, one of the things is when if I'm Sigmund Freud and I'm asking you to recount something that happened in your childhood, Rank was smart enough to notice that no, that need not be a true memory of what happened. That need not be a true account of what happened. That is your memory of what happened. So automatically, we're on a completely different ground than reality. How you remember, or even recount to me what happened in your childhood. I could call in some people from your family, and they'll go, "What? That never happened. I'll guarantee you." Sisters, brothers, cousins, nephews. This has been actually all analyzed. And so quickly, some psychoanalysts realized, hold on a minute, this is a fest. Somebody walks in because they're paying the money, and they can spiel whatever kind of story about their past, and they can do it so in very, very creative ways. And the therapist sitting in there, gullibly, not aware of the skeins of self-deception in a person, a client, and not even deal with that. And the greatest therapist who did deal with this was Karen Horney, the girlfriend of Erich Fromm. She was the greatest on this and wrote 5 monumentally important books on psychoanalysis dealing with this particular chicanery and malingering of clients. And of course, it was more suppressed because the psychoanalytical movement obviously was compromised and didn't want to really focus on that kind of thesis, even though as much as they didn't like Thomas Szasz and their open critics, they didn't even like Karen Horney's work from inside psychoanalysis because she was talking about malingering. And just to finish that point, Thomas Szasz says that malingering had actually been noted in the original memoirs of the first psychoanalysts. These are the precursors to Freud, people like Charcot and Bleuler over in Paris. They knew that the women in these institutions were malingering and coming up with all sorts of syndromes. And for a while, the psychoanalysts noted it, says Szasz. But then, when they started to get funding and they started to develop psychoanalysis, they changed their spots and they started to take these malingering accounts as real. So he points to a deception, at the very root of the psychoanalytical movement, which Evola may have also been aware of, because there's a great tie-in here He may have been, I think he was a contemporary of Karl Kraus, who was the
May have
great
been.
master of Thomas Szasz. So they were anti-psychological, and they pointed out that these original psychotherapists covered up the story of outright malingering in their patients and started to take these accounts as authentic. So there's a big case to be made there. You know, we've gone into it in other podcasts, but I just want to let you know about that.
Yeah, I mean, there is certainly a lot of shady stuff in the history of psychoanalysis, although we probably should give credit where it's due. At least psychoanalysis contributed very much to the idea of, instead of cutting people's brains apart and throwing them in an asylum, maybe we should just talk to them. So I do appreciate the contribution to like talk therapy a little bit, but there's that whole period of like early psychoanalysis was just there's just so many unethical things going on.
Yeah.
Fortunately,
the famous
we have the
case
benefit
of
of hindsight.
Oh yeah, we could talk a lot about it. You know, these early cases like Anna O and Little Hands. It's not quite what people think. It's a very tangled story. I'm still in favor personally of psychoanalysis, but for several reasons. But the main one that I always cite, they say, Michael, you're such a, you know, you speak a lot to criticize it, but then you always come out saying that you're in favor of it at the end. Why is that? I've had people, you know, write to me about that and say they're very, very confused. And my answer is always the same. The abysmal state of human consciousness today.
Mhm.
If you could stand back and see how absolutely dire it is in terms of the Weininger view and the Blakean view and the Evolian view, then you would say that any port in a storm, you know, any razor blade that you throw to a drowning man is needed. I'm in favor of it because at least it's something therapeutic in a state of absolute human debauchery. You know.
Right. It's kind of a secular solution to what is ultimately a spiritual problem. But in a secular society, most people aren't looking for spiritual solutions. They want a secular solution. And I mean, when it comes to kind of spiritual development, if the prerequisite is already that you have to be a mentally balanced person, but you're not, and you want to develop spiritually, well, where do you go to get mentally balanced? I don't know that psychoanalysis is necessarily the answer, but therapy at least is some kind of a good start in terms of, you know, learning healthier mental coping mechanisms and learning how to not be reactive. I mean, you could go to any therapist's office and they'll teach you about being a little bit more personally accountable for your life and cultivating a greater sense of self-agency. And those are all very helpful things that therapy can do. And I'm very much in favor of those. And that can be then the basis from which to start developing spiritually. But it's like, you know, if you wanted to go to, like, say, a Vipassana retreat and learn how to do some really hardcore meditations, like, well, that's a 10-day retreat. That's a really difficult thing to do. And they will even tell you that if you have a history of mental illness, you're not supposed to be there. They don't want people who are mentally unbalanced to come to these retreats because those are the people who start to have problems when they meditate because they are not internally strong enough to deal with what's coming up from their subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
So I think therapy can be really useful in terms of helping people become strong enough to deal with that and then can take on a spiritual path. But that's one area where I feel like the world of tradition doesn't have the answers for the modern world that I wish it did, because it is the traditional doctrines assume a different kind of man. And we don't have that anymore in the modern world. There's not very many people who fit that definition of a human being anymore. And so these doctrines for spiritual development are assuming that we have a certain like mentioned material, and we don't.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, psychoanalysis even in the beginning stage in a sophomore way assists us in turning things around and looking at our own responsibility for the situations we get ourselves in, so that we can take stronger charge of it. It's not common for people to have that level of introspection, to be able to turn things around and say, what did I do? Or where are my boundaries? Or what was I projecting? And all of that, you know. So yeah, the
And
layman's
even to
psychology.
just be non-reactive to that.
Oh, yes.
Because
Good
you could
point.
be perfect, like for many people, I've known people who have very high self-awareness, but who are still incredibly emotionally reactive. And they'll just be aware that they're emotionally reactive, but powerless to stop being that way.
Yeah, that's for sure. Get triggered very easily. Look at our generation today.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to get into. We'll have to have you back again when
Sure.
we can delve into some more of this. It's just so widespread. There's so many, especially when it comes to the gender dysphoria and what's happening. We've had John Coleman on. He's an educator, and he's spoken some very, very interesting things on how education has been turned over to women in the last lot of decades. This is not just schooling, but in homeschooling. He actually critiques homeschooling because it's under the auspices of the mother, and he doesn't look at this as a very positive thing. So I don't know if you agree with that.
I'd have to hear his argument to know whether or not I agree with it, because I can kind of like see myself making a case for both.
Right, of course, naturally. Yeah, naturally. And it depends who the woman is and how much insight they have. But he just was looking at, he was coming at it from a very interesting point of view. And he was talking somewhat along the lines we have done about, that these gays, well, let me just explain it this way. He said that what we have today with homosexuality, especially in men, is really a closet monastic type who, because society is not able to provide them with monasteries to live in, they are fish out of water. And he says that this is not all homosexuals, of course, but he's diagnosed the homosexual type as basically a monastic spiritual type who's lost at sea and gets confused. Yes, it is interesting. And he I think he thinks of himself as one of them, but it's a very interesting, thesis in which he says that a lot of these people, and remember, forget about today's homosexual, the queer. Think back to people like Quentin Crisp and Kenneth Williams and other well-known eccentrics of, say, the Victorian era and the earlier 20th century. These were legendary figures in the media, and they were eccentric, and they were real characters, highly literate. I can definitely see when it comes to the old school homosexual male, exactly, what he's saying, that these people would have been way better off in monasteries, contemplating the mysteries and contemplating God. But as time has gone by, one of the pitfalls of modernity is we don't have that anymore. And so these people are walking around in a state that then leads to where, we see it today in male homosexuals particularly, where they're lost. And really, their orientation should be transcendent, is what John Coleman was saying. And, it was really a remarkable disclosure. There's a lot that's very close to what Evola is saying in another context there, I think.
Yeah, Evola actually addresses the question of homosexuality in one of the appendixes in Eros and the Mysteries of Love, because the whole metaphysics of sex he's kind of basing around this idea that we are seeking to reestablish the unity between the two halves. And homosexuality, of course, doesn't really fit into that framework, simply because, your starting point is a being of the same sex. So there's the polarity just simply isn't there. And his conclusion, to sum it all up, is basically that it's just a deviated form of sexuality that is oriented only towards physical gratification and has no transcendent orientation whatsoever.
Yeah, and I can see the case for that as well. It would fit what I've said in Dragon Mother about the types, that it's born out of antipathy to the female, and that's all. It's just it's pathological. Why? Is because they're not addressing their antipathy to the feminine in a conscious way, and it leaks out in the lower chakra expression when it should be mentalized and brought to consciousness. But we need not go into all of that right now. That's
So
maybe
many
I could send
anima
you.
possessed men out there and animus
Well,
possessed women too.
that's a very good way of looking at it as well. And yeah, the whole thing with the Jungian anima and animus. But see, how can you even explain that to somebody who's confused about the connection between femininity and femaleness?
Or to a man who is completely rejecting of the idea that he has anything feminine within him at all.
Oh my goodness.
It's like,
What?
where do you even start?
That's extraordinary. Don't tell me that you've met people like that.
Oh yeah, I have. I've also encountered men who are convinced that there's nothing masculine about them and that they ought to just be women.
What?
So the state of the sexes is very, very poor at the moment, and it's actually very depressing.
That is not only depressing, that is horrendous in the sense that, see, I would interpret that as that it's not their gender they're trying to escape from, it's selfhood.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to describe it.
It's selfhood itself in a monadical way, but they are interpreting it as if changing sex will solve a problem that's much, much deeper.
Well, ultimately, we are just this temporary arrangement of atoms. And the goal of spirituality is to sort of overcome these biological conditions. To become fixated on whether or not you're a man or a woman is inherently anti-spiritual. Now, it is true that we cannot have any other existence outside of being a man or a woman. That is a distinct binary category. But we are also not just men and women. We are not just our biological sex. And it concerns me the degree to which people fixate on the biological. It's not surprising, of course, because we live in a very materialistic age where anything that's non-corporeal is assumed to be not real. But yeah, it's very disheartening to see.
Yeah, I mean, that's so profound, what you just said there. Wow.
It's something... as a woman talking about Evola, I'm often criticized for being a woman talking about Evola. And so I'm kind of just like, well, but this is just the body that I'm in for this lifetime. Like, it's not me, right? We are not our bodies. We have bodies, but they are not us. That's not our fundamental essence. It's just the vehicle that our conscious is residing in so that we can engage with the material world. And I think it's very unhealthy, the degree to which people put so much of their identity attachment into their physical attributes.
Of course it is. Or any it's like the old Aristotelian problem. Don't let one aspect of your consciousness dominate all the others. Everything you've been saying about Evola smacks of Aristotle. This need to, the doctrine of the mean. Everything should be in balance, including the sexes.
Yes, and balance is... having things in balance is a fundamental part of the ordering of the cosmos. Part of the reason our world suffers so much is because so many things are out of balance.
Well, the very word cosmos means order. So there you have it.
Yeah.
So Evola was he was caught in a bomb blast, right? Before he died. Tell me about his last years.
He didn't die from that. He actually lived a long time after, and most of his books were even written after he was paralyzed. So he was walking around in Vienna during a bombing raid and was hit with some shrapnel. He spent months and months recuperating in a hospital and was left paralyzed from the waist down, spent the rest of his life in a wheelchair, which he described as a minor inconvenience, which I think is very stoic of him. I wonder the mental toll it took on him, though, because he was he was an avid mountain climber and stuff. He was very active, and to be confined to a wheelchair after that must have been really quite depressing. I know René Guénon thought it might have been the work of black magic. I think Evola disavowed that, but he seemed to take it in stride and to as he said, it's a minor inconvenience. He wasn't going to let it stop him from doing the work that he felt needed to be done.
Was he a man of means and wealth?
No, his financial fortunes were pretty up and down over the years. There were a lot of times where he was not getting paid for his writing, and yeah, so he wasn't necessarily like financially independent.
That's terrible. Did he leave any sons or daughters?
No, he never married, never had children.
Yeah.
He was not the marrying type, he said.
There's your monastic type that John Coleman was talking about.
Yeah, he was on the vertical path. He didn't want the hindrances of the horizontal.
Oh, understood. Yeah, understood. Are you planning to do more of his books in audio?
They've told me I can do any Evola book narration that I want to do. So I may do more in the future. I'd love to do like Mystery of the Grail, for example. I know Yoga of Power hasn't been done yet, but the amount of Sanskrit in that book is going to make it a real challenge. When I was recording Eros, there's about 10 different languages that show up in that book, and I'm just trying to pronounce them all correctly. And I'm like texting with my friends and being like, can you audio record yourself saying this phrase for me? Because maybe they speak that language. And I'm just sitting there practicing it over and over just to get out one sentence. So if I have to do a whole book full of Sanskrit, I think I might, it might take a really long time to get it done. But it should be done. It's a great book, and it's a very valuable book, as is Mystery of the Grail, which that one's one of my favorites. So I would love to do that one. Yeah. And I think that one really needs to be an audiobook.
Yeah, I've read that. That's exceptional as well. In fact, it's very good in a way for getting into his overall philosophy as well, actually.
Yeah, like I would usually recommend people start with Revolt Against the Modern World, just because it's the broad overview of his entire worldview that all of his other books are premised on. But Mystery of the Grail is an excellent book to either follow up with directly or to read concurrently with it. It was originally started out as an appendix to Revolt, actually, but then he was encouraged to turn it into a book on its own.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Kat, thanks for coming on and letting us, this has been we've wanted to do something on Evola for a very, very long time, but we needed somebody who could do justice to the ideas, and who is themselves committed to his theories, not just some, spokesman on the outside. Somebody who's actually deeply involved with his ideas is what we wanted, and you're just perfect for doing that.
I try to live these beliefs to the best of my abilities in the modern world. And if you ever need anybody to talk about sacred kings and solar symbolism and all of that stuff with, I'm your girl.
Yeah, we definitely know that. And we definitely want you back to talk about more of these actual beliefs as well. Here we've talked about the man and his beliefs, but there's a moment to get into the Grail and to get into the old Aryan story and the story of traditionalism. There's some, the metaphysics of it. I mean, that would be where we really want to go. This was just an introduction, I think.
Yeah, well, hopefully very soon we'll be able to release our episode on the soul of chivalry from the Revolt Against the Modern World chapter. And that'll be almost 2 hours long. And it goes into all kinds of stuff, from the symbolism of the woman and the horse to the Templars, to the qualifications to be a knight, and just the conflict with the Catholic Church and the kings and all of this kind of stuff. So it should be great. And anybody who's interested in Mystery of the Grail will probably enjoy that episode.
Yes, when it's done, we'll bring you on to give us a summary.
Awesome. I'll make sure you get sent a copy of it.
And I'd love to send you my Dragon Mother book,
I would love to read it.
A copy
I've heard you mention it many times. I've heard other people talk about it, and it's one that I don't have. So that'd be awesome.
I'll get it to you. Yeah, and make sure we'll get you the Otto Weininger site that I have. I think you'll like it.
Yeah, I would like to have that handy.
Okay, love. Thank you. David, did you have any questions?
Honestly, guys, that was just an amazing conversation. I was taking lots of notes, and Evola's kind of out of my wheelhouse. I got to look into him more. I've only brushed past a few passages here and there. So thanks, Kat, for bringing all this awesome info and great commentary. So yeah, that'll do for now, and we look forward to bringing you back in the future. And congratulations on all your new works and everything coming out. Did you want to leave anybody any specific websites or anything that they can follow you on?
Well, if anybody wants to check out the website for The Soul of Chivalry, because we do have a website for it since we submitted it to a few film festivals, it's soulofchivalry.com. There's a trailer there that you can watch. My own website is astrologicat.com, but that's just for like astrology bookings and stuff. So not like a bunch of interesting content on there or anything, but it is there. And people can follow me on all the socials under PhilosophiCat, and subscribe to YouTube to get notified of the new episode coming out.
Excellent. Well, we'll link some of that down below for everybody so they can follow your work, and we'll definitely be in touch. So thanks again. That was amazing, and looking forward to the next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, our pleasure. Well, thanks also to our members. Stay tuned here. We're going to have a little break for the holidays here, and then we've got all of 2025 ahead of us. Lots of amazing content, guests, and updates that are coming your way. So stay tuned here on Unslaved, and we'll catch everybody again soon. Cheers.